I mean, in terms of this G20 finance ministers meeting, we talk about them trying to save the global economy, but in a sense, are they also trying to save global stability, given what we've just seen in that report?
They are, and I think what we've heard from Alistair Darling is words like, united progress and all these sorts of things. But I think where that report alludes is that each of the politicians, and for the most part they are politicians that are at this meeting, are playing to their own countries, their own electorates in the case of those that are elected. And so that the pressure on them is really to come up with the solution for their own economies and for their own policies, not just simply to come up with a united package of measures that can be agreed at this particular summit.
We're expecting Alistair Darling to speak anytime soon and to effectively tell us what they've decided, if anything. This is a preliminary meeting, but effectively it's very important, isn't it?
I think it probably is important in many ways. I mean, certainly the situation we're in is very important. We have a global economic crisis, and rarely has one of these meetings been quite so eagerly anticipated and so much pressure on it. Whether it can come up with the sort of response that is needed for it to be of such importance, I think remains to be seen.
It seems strange that there is this division between countries that want regulatory reform and countries that want fiscal stimulus. Surely all countries want both of those things, or all countries at least need both of those things.
Yes, I mean, I think the regulatory reform doesn't address the issue of a global economic crisis. It perhaps addresses some of the issues of why the thing happened in the first place, but certainly by simply coming up with regulatory reforms, it won't stimulate the economy. It won't bring prosperity back to the world. I imagine in some respects it's perhaps a side issue which can be concentrated on as something where you can say, no, actually this is what's important.
But is that picture that's being depicted of this division accurate? Because, it seems as though the US and Britain are the ones that are arguing for fiscal stimulus over regulation. But actually, when you listen to Brown and Obama talk at any time over the past few weeks, they've been talking about transparency, regulation, better systems. I mean, that seems contradictory.
I think a lot of what Alistair Darling's been saying in the last few days is quite contradictory. I think very little can be expected from this communique. I think they will clearly have an agreement, but there's two reasons. One is, as you point out, these countries don't all agree, and secondly, this is a prelude to the meeting that's going to happen in a couple of weeks' time, where the presidents and the prime ministers are going to be there. And if there is an agreement, and if there is a big idea, which I frankly don't think there is, because if there were, we'd have heard of it, that's where that would be announced. But of course, each of these countries, and there are blocks of countries with different interests, each of them actually has a very different interest in this and a very different response. So yes, Britain and the United States want a more fiscal stimulus. Germany and France are very much against this, and we've seen this meeting with Brown and Merkel today, and Brown looked very grumpy. Actually, didn't get quite what he wanted out of Merkel.
In terms of those meeting at the G20 Finance Ministers Summit today, they would have all read these headlines this morning about tax havens being brought in and essentially forced to declare their hand, if you like. Does that prove that actually what we need is more punitive measures, more rules-based systems, rather than sort of principle-based systems?
I don't think it necessarily means that, no. And I think we can talk about the regulatory side of things a great deal, and of course they're going to have to deal with those issues. But it doesn't get to the crux of the issue, which is that there's a global economic downturn, a global recession. There's talk, and Alistair Darling keeps alluding to this, worst economic downturn since the 1930s. I suspect it's more like Japan, actually, of 10 or 15 years ago. But still, that's the great fear. And regulatory reforms in itself will not solve an economic downturn.
All right. Thanks very much, Stephen Barber. We'll talk to you again later. Let's get some more on this issue now. We can speak to Stephen Barber. He's he's from the Global Policy Institute. Thanks very much. Some interesting comments there, though fairly short on detail. How significant do you think it is that he said that they would continue to use unconventional measures to deal with this? What does that actually mean?
Well, I think that was key. You've got to feel a bit sorry for Alistair Darling because he can't get agreement at this summit, clearly. But that was key to everything he said. I jotted down a few of the things that he said. He spent a lot of time talking about bank lending, and clearly they've all agreed with that. And then a huge amount of the time talking about the supervisory and regulation. But key is, of course, what will they do in terms of fiscal expansion? And he didn't mention it in his speech, but actually in a question afterwards, he said, I wrote it down, he said, We're not prescribing what countries need to do, which means that finance ministers will go back to their countries and do whatever's right for their own individual countries. Well, of course they're going to do that. They're going to do that anyway. And surely the point of a meeting of this kind is to agree a united course of action, a package of measures which he cannot get.
But he did mention something that he's been talking about in recent days, and that is providing governments or regulators with the power to essentially tell banks when they're stretching themselves too far during the good times. Given that that's mentioned in the communique, does that mean that there is agreement from the G20 nations on that?
I think the G20 nations appear to be relatively in agreement when it comes to saying we need to sort out global regulation and regulation of financial institutions to stop what happened before happening again. But what's important about this meeting and happening right at the moment is that there's a global economic downturn which needs some form of action to deal with it. And I think what Alistair Darling would have liked to have walked away from this meeting with is a package of measures, an agreement from his colleagues across the world that these are the sort of things that they're going to do.
But if there is agreement on that concept, surely that's pretty significant, because many people would argue that that's what's gotten us into this trouble now.
It's certainly perhaps what got us into it. It's not what will get us out of it, and it's kind of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. It is significant, it is very important, but it won't solve the economic problems.
Very briefly then, going forward from here, it's going to be difficult for the G20 leaders when they meet in April to agree on anything, isn't it?
Oh, I think so, yeah. I jotted down some of the words he used: sense of direction, cooperation, consensus and progress. There wasn't any real substance when it comes to these package of measures, and it's not clear what President Obama wants. We've seen from this meeting with Gordon and Merkel today that he couldn't persuade the Germans that actually spending on a fiscal stimulus, a third fiscal stimulus actually in the case of Germany, is important. He can't get agreement across these countries.
Stephen Barber, thanks very much for being with us.
I'm joined by Stephen Barber. He's a political economist and senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute. That's a think tank based in London. So we heard Alistair Darling there saying that the G20 will do whatever is necessary to boost the world economy. So there seems to be agreement on the broad principles, but nothing specific, nothing concrete.
Well, there seems to be broad agreement on some things, and I think you're right, it's in terms of principle. In terms of greater regulation, yes, they seem to have agreed on. In terms of liquidity for the banks, they seem to have agreed on. But it's much woollier when it comes down to the sort of fiscal measures, the fiscal stimulus. It boiled down to pretty much just getting the IMF to look into it to present a sense of direction. And I think this is where you have to feel a bit sorry for Alistair Darling, because he can't get agreement amongst the G20.
But how much stimulus is needed to line people's pockets? Because we've been talking about how regulation is all very well when we're looking to the future to prevent another global collapse, but that is not what is specifically needed now in order to boost the economy. But how much stimulus is needed to kickstart a recovery? Where do you draw the line?
Yes, you're right. I mean, regulation is clearly a very important issue. It's the sort of things that got us into the mess, the inadequate oversight. And it's the sort of things that these finance ministers need to look into. But in itself, it won't get us out of the global economic downturn that we've seen. The problem is that there's competing positions and competing interests. It's said that the UK and the US want to have further fiscal stimulus, and certainly what Gordon Brown would like from this whole process is to have a cover for the budget, which he's delayed until after the summit, so that he can increase borrowing and increase spending. Across Europe, in Germany and France, there's a very different opinion. Germany is very reluctant to spend extra cash. It thinks it's already spent it. And if you saw the other meeting that took place with Angela Merkel and Gordon Brown today, where Gordon Brown's face said it all. I think he couldn't get Angela Merkel to agree to further fiscal stimulus, and that's where this whole process is coming to a bit more difficult than it might have done.